Okay, hi, I'm Erica and this is Sarah, and we're gonna do our current event analysis project for you today. We just want to start off by saying that there's a brief trigger warning because we will contain stories and pictures of kids who have been in uncomfortable positions with police officers or justice officers, such as being placed in handcuffs. So if that's going to upset you, please feel free to excuse yourself. So the event that we're talking about today took place on December 20th in Vancouver in Canada at a BMO bank. So on December 20th, 2019, Tori Ann Johnson was handcuffed and detained at BMO. Tori Ann was an Indigenous girl who had been trying to open a bank account with her grandfather. So what happened was she tried to open a bank account and gave the teller at the bank her status card and her identification information, which the teller did not understand. Went ahead and called the police to report identity fraud. This goes against BMO's policies, where the teller should have gone to their manager on site before calling the police. So that was the first issue. The second issue was that the police showed up to the BMO where Tori Ann and her grandfather were waiting cooperatively, and they proceeded to handcuff Tori Ann and her grandfather before even asking any questions. So she was handcuffed for about 45 minutes while they asked their questions, and then she was only uncuffed. So what ended up happening after the fact was that obviously the bank teller was reprimanded, and BMO apologized in terms of how their teller reacted, and they ensured that there were going to be new policies put in place to prevent this going forward. So events like this foster mistrust for police officers, white people, and the state. After this incident, we can't imagine how Tori Ann and her grandfather must have felt. In an interview following the accident, Tori Ann states that she just tries not to think about it. A Facebook user who commented on one of the articles wrote, "Sadly, this won't be the first time she faces racism." Unfortunately, this is true. Indigenous people face racism every day, and Indigenous women and girls face disproportionate amounts of violence in Canada.
A grandfather and a granddaughter getting arrested seems unimaginable to most people, but that just sort of comes from our shared belief that law enforcement is trustworthy, safe, and most importantly, there to protect us from harm. Unfortunately, racial profiling has been long associated with Canada's criminal justice system. Many people discuss colonization as Canada's dark history, but colonization is a continued systemic and institutional violence that First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people face every day. One way we see continued colonization in this country is through police racism and sexist violence towards Indigenous people. Current political discourse amongst settler Canadians paints this time to be a state of reconciliation, but many Indigenous leaders argue otherwise. It's clear in the coverage of the story that Canada is still attempting to cover its colonial, continued social and systemic violence against Indigenous people. Non-Indigenous newspapers published several articles on the story, highlighting it as a horrible mistake, poor judgment, and above all else, an isolated event. In the articles fed to the general public, race and Canada's colonial history were given little attention, yet in Indigenous news, coverage of this incident is seen as one of many traumatizing outright displays of continued and persistent racism. As discussed in class, Foucault believes that discourses can be found within language, and the power of discourses operate invisibly. By comparing the language used by non-Indigenous and Indigenous authors, it's clear that our media is reaffirming and strengthening the false reconciliation narrative.
So, Western developmental discourses have constructed childhood as a time of innocence and vulnerability, but our discourses of childhood have historically been used as an exclusionary practice. By narrowly defining what childhood is, it becomes a tool of prescribing status and power. Throughout Canadian history, Indigenous children have been dehumanized and stripped of their child status within society. Indigenous children were not seen as innocent, so instead of being protected, they were viewed as a threat to white children and society, therefore in need of constant policing. Generations later, Indigenous children like Tori Ann are still dehumanized and excluded from certain discourses of childhood. The fact that Tori Ann is a child and her age matters much less than her race throughout the colonial lens. If Torianne had been white, maybe she would have been politely asked about the confusion of her identity, and if she was white, I can almost guarantee that she would not have been handcuffed.
This event could have led to a public discussion about Indigenous and police relations and the racial profiling of minority youth, but unfortunately it did not. In class we have discussed the invisibility of discourse and how we socially position the other in the margins of society, and we believe it's our job as childhood and youth studies students to discuss these social and political issues through a critical lens.
So we can see in this slide that there are certain juvenile detention centers that are dependent on age, so that children of a certain age aren't going to normal prisons. Cars around the world have airbag warnings that are based on age. They're not based on your race or your religion. Playing in play structures in McDonald's, which is a globally recognized franchise, is based on your age. It's not based on your race or your culture or how much money your parents have. Age is of the utmost importance. However, it is often being considered last in discourse with childhood, and that's not okay. If we take a look at the next slide, there are 3 children who have been placed in handcuffs. The first child is 11 years old. He had autism and he wandered away from school. The police handcuffed him and brought him back to his father, who took this picture and was utterly disgusted by how traumatized his son was. It made no sense for them to handcuff a child who was lost. The second picture has 2 controversial areas to be discussed. So the first one is the fact that a mother called the police on her own child. The second one is that the police officer went ahead and followed through and did put handcuffs on the child, who is visibly upset. The child is not resisting arrest. The child is obviously quite distraught and is only 8 years old. The third picture is a child with ADHD who was put in handcuffs by a resource officer because he wouldn't stop crying. So in all 3 of these pictures, age was considered last, despite it being extremely relevant in policy, justice, infrastructure, and it's causing trauma for everyone involved.
So we can use Foucault's concept of regimes of truth to deconstruct Torianne, the event that happened to Torianne, but not only Torianne, but the children that were just shown. So we can use it to deconstruct the event, the coverage of the story, and public discourses. The discourses we have discussed in this presentation reinforce and uphold the settler colonial state and work to uphold white supremacy. The power of all these discourses at play together keeps those in power unquestioned. Foucault described how on the macro and micro scale, discourses, power, and language are not to be understood separately, but are to be understood as a system that tirelessly works to produce knowledge and ultimately the truths that form society, our practices, our way of thinking, and where we are positioned within society. In the case of this event, the teller flagged Torianne and her grandfather as a threat, and the police chose to handcuff them until proven innocent, all because of hidden discourses that the other is to be feared, monitored, and policed. Because of this experience, Torianne will probably now be more fearful of law enforcement and become self-surveillant. Foucault argues the threat of power or the perception that one is being watched can result in individuals regulating or normalizing their own behavior.
It is important to think critically about all of our media. We need to question the sources, we need to be aware of the language used, and question what is not being said. The media is a powerful tool that is used to push political agendas, and as individuals pursuing a career with children and youth, we have the responsibility to think critically about the media we're consuming. We urge all of you to follow Indigenous news outlets so you can broaden your understanding of Canadian issues. What it really makes us wonder at the end of the day is what happened to being innocent until proven guilty.
So yeah, the questions that we have for you guys to answer in the comment section. You can go ahead with the first 2.
I mean, like I said, the first one was what happened until innocent until proven guilty. They weren't acting out right in any way. And where is the disconnect? So where is the disconnect between, I mean, so many things. You've got where is the apology for Torianne and the Indigenous people that's actually going to make a difference and fix this going forward? I just feel like they did a lot, BMO did a lot to fix this going forward. I feel like the police did a lot to fix this going forward, but I feel like the victims themselves haven't been you know,
haven't had much justice.
haven't had
maybe.
justice, support, emotional retribution.
Yeah, and not enough of recognition that this was racial profiling. I think that that's really lacking in the apologies. I think that they may have brushed upon the fact that this had to do with race, but this is solely about race. So, the next two questions are, why do you think Indigenous children and youth receive little media coverage? And then the fourth question, how do you think settlers can be allies to Indigenous peoples and show their solidarity and support in times like these and in all others? Okay, well, thank you very much for tuning in.
Until next time.